Why couldn't the eagles just fly the ring to Mordor? Why couldn't Gandalf just call them on their little eagle cell phones and ask them to come pick them up? I hate it here. Let's talk about it. Okay, so obviously we are talking about the eagles, and more specifically, why the eagles couldn't just fly the ring to Mordor. Okay, this is the number one question that is asked, I think, within the Lord of the Rings universe. So I am going to be telling you why the eagles could not simply fly the ring to Mordor. But before we get into it, we are going to answer a listener question. And Alex asks, how the hell was Aragorn able to fight so many Nazgul at once? Okay, so I'm going to assume you're talking about when Frodo was stabbed by the Morgul blade at Weathertop, right? So Aragorn was fearless and thus a great threat to the Nazgul's primary strength, which is fear, right? So here's a man who does not fear them, charges right at them and shows no fear, rendering their only true power useless. The element of surprise was also a pretty big part of it. My man showed up out of nowhere, absolutely swinging. Aragorn also used fire to drive them off. Their strength also lies in darkness, and obviously fire is light. And another factor is that only 5 of the Nazgul were present during that time on Weathertop, which I don't mean to say only 5, like it's no big thing. That's a terrifying amount of Nazgul. One Nazgul is too many Nazgul, but it wasn't the entire army of Nazgul, I guess, is like the bone I am trying to throw to Aragorn here, right? So it's a combination of Aragorn being well and truly fearless, using light to stave off darkness, which is a fantasy trope we know and love. And it's also good to remember that Aragorn is not depicted to be as powerful as he is in the books. He's quite a bit more powerful, or his power is more present and showcased better in the books than it is in the film. They kind of just make him like a regular guy in the film. So Aragorn is quite powerful, but I don't think we fully understand that through how the films are presented. But yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. Aragorn's a fucking G. He's the best, and that is pretty much it. I don't know. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, I don't care. I'm sorry. Anyways, on to the Eagles. This is probably the most titular question in the Tolkien universe, right? We all kind of understand this, whether we are fans of Lord of the Rings or not. This question plagues mostly green Lord of the Rings fans, or is a favorite among trolls thinking they're about to get the better of a Tolkien fan, only to be met with a verbal onslaught of words they've probably never heard before, explaining exactly why the Eagles could not simply Uber the ring over to Mordor. Before we get into the ins and the outs, what exactly are the Eagles? The Eagles are an American rock band formed in Los Angeles in 1971, with 5 #1 singles and 6 #1 albums, 6 Grammy Awards, and 5 American Music Awards. The Eagles were one of the most successful musical acts of the 1970s in North America. Okay, obviously I am just kidding, but what a good joke, right? The desire to turn this entire episode into a troll episode about the band is so strong right now. It would be so easy to do an 8-minute episode where I'm just like, yeah, the Eagles couldn't take the ring to Mordor because they were on tour at the time. But jokes aside, I'd actually really love to tell you a bit about the Eagles. So let's do it for real this time. So the Eagles were immense flying birds that were sapient and could speak. Very plainly, that is what the eagles were. Often very emphatically referred to as the great eagles, they appear usually and intentionally serving as agents of eucatastrophe in Tolkien's legendarium. From the Silmarillion and the accounts of Numenor to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the eagles have been a deep part of Tolkien's lore from the jump. The eagles are usually thought to have been similar to actual eagles, as far as aesthetically, very large raptor-like birds with similar coloring, but much, much larger. In the Silmarillion, Thorondor is said to have been the greatest of them, and of all birds, with a wingspan of 30 fathoms. That's 180 fucking feet. Elsewhere, the eagles have varied in nature and size, both within Tolkien's writings and in later visualizations and films. But the consistency is clear. These birds big as fuck. The difference between common eagles and great eagles is prominently described in The Hobbit. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. The great eagles were ruled by Thorondor, who appeared in the first tale about Middle-earth that Tolkien wrote in the late 1910s, The Fall of Gondolin, published in the Book of Lost Tales. The role of Thorondor was expanded in stages, with the successive introduction of the relevant plot elements, and after the conception of Numenor entered in, I think around the 1930s, the notion that the eagles were the messengers of Manwë was further elaborated on around this time as well. Soon after, Tolkien introduced the eagles into The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, repeating in the latter some plot elements and names present in older writings. So he kind of, created the eagles from the jump. They were always there in Tolkien's initial Middle-earth, and then he used a lot of those initial writings in stories about the eagles and started to incorporate them in later stories that take place later in Middle-earth, such as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, right? In several early texts, Tolkien wrote that before moving to Chrysaegrim after the death of Fingolfin, the eagles of Thorondor nested upon the peaks of Thangorodrim above Morgoth's fortress of Angband. Christopher Tolkien assumes that this idea was later abandoned. Another rejected proposal was that after Berin's death, Luthien would not pass of grief, but would be carried to Valinor by Thorondor, who would have been summoned by Melian of the Maya. So this is really interesting to me. So in the story of Beren and Luthien, Luthien dies of grief, essentially, but there was kind of like an alternative ending where Thorondor, the greatest of the eagles, would have been summoned by Melian, who was a Maya and Luthien's mother, right? And Thorondor would have carried Luthien to Valinor, which I think is pretty epic and romantic. But, Beren and Luthien is one of my favorite stories. I like how it ended, but it is cool to kind of get insight into what could have been, Tolkien was very big on alternative endings, that is for sure. Okay, so in Tolkien's early writings, the eagles were distinguished from other birds. And it's kind of described as Ea, which is the universe, right? The world was bounded by the walls of night, and the space above the earth up to the walls was divided into 3 regions. Common birds could keep aloft only within the lower layer. So that would be birds like here on Earth, right? These birds can only fly so high, while the eagles of Manwë could fly beyond the lights of heaven to the edge of darkness. Space birds. That's pretty much what they're saying here in so many words, is these eagles could kind of fly into what would be a space, I guess. I hate saying that because it sounds so literal and it feels insane to visualize a giant eagle just flying into space. But Ea is kind of the universe that surrounds the world. You'll probably hear me say this a lot. the eagles, being not gods, but godlike, could physically go beyond, where normal birds could go, because they are not normal birds. That was a lot of words to just say that these birds are magical and can go into space if they want. I don't know what to tell you. It is very hard to explain. Anyways, okay. So the conception of the limited world and of the layers of the firmament was rejected during the writing of The Lord of the Rings. So this still gives you insight to how Tolkien viewed his creation of the eagles to set them apart from other creatures of the world. Other creatures get this ethereal, mysterious kind of treatment too, as we know, such as Ungoliant and Juan, the Hound of Valinor, who is a power player in the story of Beren and Luthien. He was essentially a magic dog. The question of the great eagle's nature was faced by Tolkien with apparent hesitation, right? In early writings, there was no need to define it precisely, since he imagined that beside the Valar, quote, unquote, many lesser spirits, both great and small, had entered the Ea upon its creation, in such sapient creatures as the eagles or Huan the Hound, in Tolkien's own words, quote unquote, have been rather lightly adopted from less serious mythologies. So again, Tolkien is kind of taking inspiration from other mythologies here, to where, yeah, we have regular dogs that would live in the Shire or anywhere else in Middle Earth, but then we have magic dogs like Huan the Hound, and we have magic eagles, and we got regular birds. We've got it all, right? And this is very akin to a lot of mythology as well. So the phrase spirits in the shape of hawks and eagles in the Silmarillion derives from this stage of writing. After the completion of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien moved toward a more carefully defined system of creatures, with few, if any, exceptions. And we're going to go through this list in a second, but I want to clarify that Tolkien kind of started out being like, yeah, we got regular birds and we got space birds. We got fucking regular dogs. We got space dogs. And was very loosey-goosey about it because he was writing in a more fantastical way. But as he embellished on this world, he kind of wanted to give it a system that tied it to reality a little bit more. And I use the term reality loosely, but I think you guys understand what I mean. So this is the more carefully defined system of creatures per Tolkien. So we have incarnates, or the children of Iluvatar. That would be elves, men, dwarves, and orcs, those who possessed souls with the defining characteristic of being able to speak. We have self-incarnates, or the Valar and Maiar, angelic spirits that arrayed themselves in bodily forms or animal forms, able to communicate both by thought and speech. And lastly, animals, unable to speak. Plain and simple, 3 categories. We've got incarnates, self-incarnates, and then literally everything else, right? For some time, Tolkien considered the eagles as bird-shaped Maiar. However, later he realized that the statement about Gwaihir and Landrivel's descent from Thorondor, and we will talk about these guys in a second, had already appeared in print in The Lord of the Rings, while the notion of the children of the Valar and Maiar had been rejected by him long before. So essentially, he got lost in his own sauce here and forgot where he kind of aligned these things, which I can only imagine is incredibly easy to do when you are creating such an expansive world. So, in the last of his notes on this particular topic, dated by his son to be in the late 1950s, Tolkien decided that the great eagles were common animals that had been taught language by the Valar and raised to a higher level, but they still had no fear. Fear is a Quenya word for soul or indwelling spirit of an incarnate being. Okay? It's spelled like fear, but pronounced fair. I'm doing a terrible job, but you fucking get it. Anyways, cut me some slack. So essentially, they are not gods like many people seem to think, at least not in the way the Valar or the Maiar are. A lot of people seem to think this. They were essentially devised by the king of the Valar, Manwë, to act as spies for him, so they were essentially regular animals chosen and elevated by Manwë of the Valar, with purpose, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't, but that's okay. It's fantasy. Anyways, we will talk about eagles more in their own episode. I would love to get granular with this in the future. But this should be enough context to move into why they could not simply take the ring to Mordor and just plop that bad boy in. So why, definitively, could they not? In true Occam's razor, the simplest answer makes the most sense and rings, no pun intended, the most true. They simply do not get involved in the affairs of other beings. While the War of the Ring is a huge going on for those on the ground involved, to the eagles, it was relatively off their radar. Both Gandalf and Gwaihir, descendant of the greatest eagle to ever live, were delivered to the lands of Middle-earth, but neither were greater or more kingly than the other. So, Gandalf and Gwaihir, who was another great eagle, just to clarify, are one and the same. They are equal, like nobody is above each other in the chain of command here, right? So this presents a gaping hole in the argument that Gandalf could have simply asked the eagles to carry the One Ring to Mordor, as the eagles are not under Gandalf's umbrella, nor are they a taxi service to the Istari. Why couldn't Gandalf ask them for help? Gandalf has indeed called in favors before with the eagles, but even as a Maiar, Gandalf cannot control them and knows better than to abuse his power with them. Gandalf the Grey had saved Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, from a poisoned arrow, thus creating a lifelong friendship and bond between the two. So there is some context about how and why Gandalf has this relationship with them to even begin with, right? It wouldn't have been kind or respectable for Gwaihir to ignore Gandalf's plea for aid in The Hobbit, and these eagles are about as proud and proper as they come. But this does not mean that the eagles would swoop in for just any of Gandalf's requests. Again, they do not directly serve anyone but the Valar, most specifically Manwë. Okay, so then why couldn't the Valar do anything to help with the War of the Ring? Why didn't they make the eagles help? The answer here is alarming in its simplicity. The lack of intervention by the Valar was because Sauron was weaker. If you think of it the following way, Sauron, who was never nearly as strong as Melkor and/or Morgoth, could actually be beaten by the free peoples of Middle-earth without the necessity of divine intervention, if that makes sense. So while the threat seemed huge to the elves and men of Middle-earth, if you've read the Silmarillion or other stories that took place in the First or Second Age, it's easy to see how the Valar would be like, I don't know, they've got this. It is also historically taboo for gods to intervene in the matters of men, so to speak. They created the Maiar or Istari as their way of bringing powerful beings to man to help mitigate this. So by them creating the Maiar, Istari, the wizards and the eagles, so to speak, and sending them to live in Middle-earth, that was their way of helping. Does that make sense? So why didn't the eagles fly some of the Fellowship over to Mordor to save them time? Small and quiet, yet adventurous and loyal, hobbits were the perfect choice for sending out on this treacherous journey. Though spies of the enemy knew of Frodo's quest, the focus of forces from Isengard and Mordor was split as they fought against Rohan and Gondor, thus leaving Frodo and Sam to follow a path by which they could move along mostly unseen. And this is clarified a lot in the books, and we see it pretty clearly in the films. No one is really worried about Frodo and Sam. That is essentially their greatest power. No one is worried about two hobbits. They are not pressed about it at all. The majority of Sauron's forces are obviously distracted and more worried about Rohan, Gondor, and everybody else, right? That is like a bigger threat. So even if one of the eagles had carried Frodo or Gandalf on their back with the purpose of entering the mountain, Sauron's spies would be able to spot them at just about any moment and attack. There's no hiding when you're an eagle of the Valar and are flying straight into the mouth of evil. With that said, the concentration of Sauron's forces may even be too much for a handful of the great eagles to risk their lives over. While Sauron is not the biggest threat the eagles have ever faced, it is threat enough for them to not fucking get involved. And I get it. But how is there no way they can't just do a quick drive-by and drop that shit in? The eagles of the Valar are huge, and that's an understatement. Remember how I mentioned that 180-foot wingspan? Absolute units. Not only would their flight above Mount Doom cause a stir in Sauron's forces, but there's no physical way for Gwaihir to drop the One Ring precisely into the cracks of Mount Doom. Not just into the fires of Mount Doom, you see, but in the exact spot in the mountain where the One Ring was forged. It must be destroyed exactly where it was created, and not even Gwaihir could no-scope that shit. He simply could not, and he is likely far too big to even walk his little eagle legs into the fucking mountain and drop it in. So, again, we go back to the hobbits being small and sneaky, and largely unburdened by the effects of the ring. Obviously, there is some burden, some effect. We see that with Frodo, but they are not as adept to its effects as men are, and we have seen that pretty clearly. So someone must enter the mountain itself, approach this exact volcanic fissure, and throw the ring into the fires. So we sent a tiny baby boy instead. Duh, it makes perfect sense. And to me, that is the best argument for why the eagles couldn't just drive by and drop that shit. It has to be a very particular part of the mountain where the ring was forged. This is important. Okay, well, the eagles are out. Why couldn't Gandalf or Elrond or the Valar do it? Well, here's the thing. They certainly could have. They defeated Melkor, after all, whose power far exceeded that of Sauron. Tulkas could probably have crushed Sauron with one hand tied behind his back, even if Sauron were wearing the One Ring. But their war against Melkor remade the face of Middle-earth to the extent that it was unrecognizable from its earlier form, and the Valar from that point were loath to interfere directly in the goings-on of Middle-earth. There's even a strong suggestion that the Valar were worried about destroying the living things of Middle-earth in what would probably be a WWE match with Middle-earth as the wrestling ring, right? I also like the point made in an earlier answer. The Valar didn't want to interfere too much, since that would suggest that Eru's vision for the history of Middle-earth was somehow flawed and needed their correction. So again, it kind of like circles back into this like divine intervention. Should gods meddle with the affairs of the free people? This is something we historically see in fantasy and in mythology in general, right? So don't forget that the Valar did lend their help. The Istari, the wizards, Saruman the White, Gandalf the Grey, Radagast the Brown, and Alatar and Palando, the never spoken of again for some reason, blue wizards, were Ainur, just like Sauron, sent from Valinor expressly to advise and encourage the free peoples of Middle-earth in their resistance against Sauron. So, as a side note, this is also why we don't see the wizards doing much other than giving counsel. This wasn't supposed to be a war of angelic powers against each other with the free people as collateral damage. This was a war where the free peoples took back their neighborhood on their own power as much as possible. I know that's like not the most exciting explanation to why like gods couldn't come in and just, end things very quickly. That also very simply would not have been as good of a story. I think it's good to sometimes, maybe oftentimes, just suspend disbelief a little bit, and not try to, actually, the entire thing. Just enjoy it. So in that way, the War of the Ring is a lot different than many of the other epic battles that have taken place across the ages. After the War of the Ring, we enter into the Fourth Age, where again, Middle-earth begins to look much different, which happens with every passing age. Middle-earth evolves significantly. Does that satiate the question of why we couldn't just ring toss that joint into Mount Doom? Probably not. People love to hold onto this question like it's a personality trait, but the simplicity of it all is simply that it's storytelling. You need to suspend disbelief to enjoy just about anything, but y'all can nitpick yourself into a miserable corner, and I'll be over here thinking big eagle cool. And that pretty much wraps up the episode. Thank you all for being cool as we took some time off for the holidays. Rachel even said her hair has stopped falling out, so it's a Christmas miracle, y'all. Jokes aside, this podcast stuff is a lot of work. I appreciate all of you for listening and sharing. It means a lot. And you know the drill. You have myswordpodcast.com for links to everything you could ever need except health insurance. And please write in. I love reading the overshares, and I mean that. Okay, honestly, I love you guys. And as always, you have my sword.
Edgeworks Nebula.